Tobias Mercer found the rope before he found the girl. It was tied around an old water barrel sitting square in the middle of his pasture, the same barrel that had vanished from behind his barn 2 days earlier. He had searched for it everywhere. Now here it was, sitting in the open grass like it had grown there overnight, and he knew right away that something was very wrong. The cattle would not come near the trough. They stood off in a loose knot at the far fence, snorting, refusing the water they had been drinking for years. His old dog would not stop growling low in his chest, the kind of growl that meant the dog had smelled something a man could not. Tobias walked closer, slow, the way a man walks when every instinct in his body is telling him to turn around. The damp mud beneath the trough told its own story, a man's boot prints, deep and pressed hard into the dirt. Bare footprints beside him, smaller, dragged rather than walked. And blood, dried, dark, and rust-colored, soaked into the ground where someone had been held down. He had ridden this land for 30 years. He had buried 2 wives' worth of grief into this soil, and he thought he had seen every kind of trouble Arizona Territory could throw at a man alone. He had not seen this. Behind the barrel, bound at the wrist with the same rope tied around his missing barrel, was a young woman. Yavapai or Apache, he could not tell which at first glance, only that she was exhausted past speaking, her skin streaked with dust and blood that was not entirely her own. Her eyes found his, and for one terrible second he watched fear take hold of her completely. The fear of a person who has learned that every man who finds her means her harm. Then she spoke, her voice cracked down to almost nothing. "Please, don't make me do it." Tobias did not know what "it" meant. He did not know her name, did not know who had left her here like bait in a trap built specifically for him. But 30 years of reading land and reading trouble told him one thing with total certainty. Somebody had set this scene on purpose. The missing barrel, the frightened cattle, the girl bound in the exact spot where he would find her first thing in the morning. This was not an accident. This was an invitation, and whoever had sent it knew exactly what kind of guilt still lived under Tobias Mercer's ribs. And the question that would follow Tobias Mercer for the rest of that summer was simple enough to keep any man awake at night. What do you do when the truth they want you to believe could destroy an innocent life, but the truth you don't yet know might destroy your own? He cut the rope with the knife he kept for skinning hides, his hands steadier than his racing thoughts. The girl flinched at the first touch of the blade, pulling back so hard she nearly toppled the barrel between them. She did not trust him. Why would she? To her, every white man who found her bound like this was just another version of the men who had bound her. "I am not going to hurt you," Tobias said, low and even, the same voice he used to settle a spooked horse. "Whatever you think I am not that." It took her a long while to believe him, longer still to speak. When she finally did, her name came out first, quiet and careful, like she was testing whether he deserved to know it at all. Luta Inola. And once the dam broke, the rest came pouring out in a rush of fear and exhaustion she could no longer hold back. A man named Rafe Corman had taken her 2 nights before. He was holding her younger brother, a boy named Noche, at an abandoned stage station near Clear Creek, south of Camp Verde. Corman had made her a simple, brutal offer. Lure Tobias Mercer away from his ranch, away from witnesses, and her brother would live. Refuse, and she would watch what happened to him instead. But there was more, and this was the part that turned Tobias's stomach cold. Corman had not stopped at kidnapping. He had prepared a written statement and meant to force Luta to mark it with her thumbprint, a confession she could not even read, claiming that Tobias Mercer had been hiding runaway Apache on his land and rustling cattle under cover of darkness. A lie built from nothing, waiting only for her mark before it could carry the weight of her testimony behind it. She was not only a victim in this, she was the weapon Corman intended to turn against Tobias. That was the cruelty of it. Corman did not need Luta to hate Tobias. He only needed her to be scared enough to leave a mark on paper. Tobias sat back on his heels in the trampled grass, understanding settling over him heavier than the Arizona sun. Rafe Corman wanted his water rights. Everybody in Camp Verde knew that, The man had been circling Tobias's land for 2 years, looking for any opening, any excuse the territory's courts and its prejudices would accept. A rancher caught harboring fugitive Apache and stolen cattle would not just lose his land. He would lose it with the whole town cheering the theft. Luda would not look at him now. Shame and fear had folded her in on herself, her bound wrists still raw where the rope had bitten deep. "He told me you would turn me in," she said finally. "He said every man out here would." Tobias looked at his hands, the same hands that had once led soldiers along trails toward Rio Verde, toward a removal he had never spoken of since. He had been silent once before, when silence cost people everything they had. He was not going to be silent again. But silence was not the only thing being asked of him this time. This time, the price of doing right might be his own ranch, his own name, maybe his own neck. The dust of their horses reached the ranch before Rafe Corman did. Tobias heard it first, that particular rhythm of riders not in a hurry, the kind of pace men take when they already believe they hold every card. He had maybe 90 seconds, and he used every one of them. "Hayloft," he told Luda, already moving. "Climb up, stay low, and whatever you hear, you do not make a sound." She went without arguing, her bare feet finding the ladder rungs by memory alone, and Tobias was alone in his yard by the time Rafe Corman and Deputy Ezra Pike rode in through the gate. Corman sat his horse like a man who owned the ground beneath it, which in his mind he already did. Pike stayed a half-length behind him, the kind of deputy whose badge had stopped meaning law and started meaning whatever Corman needed it to mean. "Afternoon, Tobias," Corman said, friendly as poison. "We're hunting a dangerous girl." "Apache, escaped from the column heading to San Carlos. Thought you might have wandered onto your land." Tobias kept his face as blank and weathered as the fence post beside him. "Haven't seen anybody but my own cattle in 3 days." "That's so." Corman's eyes moved slow across the yard, the barn, the loft window, lingering just long enough to let Tobias know the man already suspected the truth. "Funny thing about hiding people, Tobias. Whole town starts asking why a man would risk everything for a stranger. Starts asking what else he might be hiding." The threat sat in the air between them, plain as the afternoon heat. Tobias understood the offer being made without a single direct word spoken. Hand over the girl, and he kept his ranch, his water, his good name in Camp Verde. Stay silent, and Rafe Corman would make certain the whole territory believed Tobias Mercer was a traitor to his own kind. He had heard an offer like this before, years ago, dressed in different words, but built from the same rotten timber. Back then he had taken the easy road. He had led the soldiers exactly where they asked, told himself it was just a job, just following orders, and said nothing while families were marched off land they had lived on for generations. He told himself for years that his hands had been clean because he never fired a shot. He knew better now. Silence was never clean. Silence was just a slower kind of violence. "Nobody here but me," Tobias said again, steady as stone. Above him, in the dark heat of the hayloft, one frightened breath could have ruined them both. Corman held his gaze a long moment, then finally turned his horse, Pike following close behind, both men riding off toward the tree line, but not toward town. Tobias understood that too. They were not leaving. They were watching. And watching men were worse than charging men, because they gave a man just enough time to imagine every way he could die. That night, by lantern light in the barn, Tobias handed Luda his spare coat against the thin high country chill, then a small skinning knife for her own protection, then a canteen of water he refilled twice before she stopped drinking. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing easy to say, but something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange. Something neither one of them had a name for yet, built not from words, but from the simple fact that for the first time in longer than she could remember, somebody had chosen her safety over their own. If this story has made you wonder what silence can cost, subscribe now, because Tobias Mercer's choice was only beginning. By midnight, the decision was made. They would ride toward Clear Creek before sunrise, toward the abandoned stage station, toward Noche, and toward whatever waited for them there. Neither of them said the obvious. If Corman had built the trap this carefully, he would not be waiting there alone. The stage station sat half collapsed against the gray light before dawn, its roof sagging like a tired old animal finally lying down to rest. Tobias and Luda left their horses a quarter-mile back and came the rest of the way on foot, low through the brush, the way Tobias used to move when he still wore a scout's reputation instead of a rancher's quiet. What they found inside told its own story fast. Cattle penned in the old stable stalls, branded fresh, the iron marks still raw enough to smell of burned hide. Tobias recognized the pattern of theft immediately. Corman had been running stolen stock through here for months, hiding them just long enough to alter the brands before driving them to buyers who never asked questions. And there, on an overturned crate, sat a second branding iron, Tobias's own mark, copied close enough to fool any inspector who did not look twice. He understood now exactly how deep the trap had been dug. Not just a false confession. Physical proof, planted and waiting, that would have hung him the moment anybody official came looking. For one cold second, Tobias understood that if they died in this station, Corman's lie would live longer than either of them. Before he could process it further, the door at the far end slammed open. Rafe Corman filled the frame, a pistol already drawn, and Deputy Pike a step behind him, dragging young Noche by the collar, the boy's wrists bound and his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever have to carry. "You should have just turned her in," Corman said, almost disappointed, like Tobias had failed some simple test. "Now we do this the hard way." He shoved a folded paper and an ink pad toward Luda, his pistol pressed flat against Noche's temple, leaving no room for refusal. Luda's hands shook violently as she reached for the pad, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. "Please," she said, and her voice broke entirely on the word. The same plea Tobias had heard from her once before, except now it was aimed at fate itself rather than at him. "Please, don't make me do it." Tobias did not think. He moved. He was not a fast man anymore, hadn't been fast in 15 years. But he was heavy and stubborn, and he had absorbed worse hits than anything Pike could offer. He drove his shoulder into the deputy like a man bracing a gate against a storm, sending them both crashing through the rotted side door in a tangle of splinters and dust. Pike's gun went off wildly into the ceiling, raining down decades of dry timber and dust. A jagged splinter tore across Tobias's shoulder, but he barely felt it through the rush of the fight. Corman swung his pistol toward Tobias, but Luda moved faster than fear should have allowed her to move. She snatched the small knife Tobias had given her and slashed through Noche's bindings in one motion, then drove her shoulder into the nearest stall gate, spilling 2 startled cattle directly into Corman's path. He stumbled, cursed, fired a shot that buried itself harmlessly in the dirt floor. In the chaos, Tobias tore his yellow bandana free and wrapped it twice around his fist, using it to wrench Pike's wrist hard enough to drop the deputy's second weapon entirely. Pike went down hard, groaning, done for the moment. Corman scrambled backward, grabbing the false confession and the copied branding iron off the crate before bolting for the horses tied outside, Pike limping fast behind him. By the time Tobias reached the doorway, both men were already half a field away, riding hard toward the tree line, the morning sun catching the dust they kicked up behind them like a closing curtain. They had escaped. But Tobias and Luda were not leaving empty-handed either. It was Noche who saw it first, pointing with a trembling hand toward the old feed sack, as if something alive were hidden inside. Tucked inside it, overlooked in the panic, sat a small tally book Corman must have used before moving the stolen cattle south, page after page marking fresh brands, altered brands, and the names of men who had helped him do it. Noche stood trembling but unharmed beside his sister, and for the first time since Tobias had found her bound at that water barrel, Luda allowed herself something close to relief. If you have made it this far, you already know this is not the kind of tale that ends with one clean victory. Subscribe now, because the truth Tobias uncovered was about to put a target on every life he had just tried to save. They rode back to the ranch as the sky turned from gray to gold, the kind of light that made even tired, bloodied people look like they might survive whatever came next. The gash across Tobias's shoulder had stiffened during the ride back, and he had not truly felt it until the adrenaline finally let go of him and the pain rushed in to fill the space it left behind. Luda tended to it herself, tearing strips from an old shirt, her hands gentle in a way that surprised them both. Neither one spoke for a long while. There was a different kind of quiet between them now, not the careful silence of strangers, but something closer to two people who had earned a little trust the hard way. It was Tobias who finally broke it. He did not speak because he expected forgiveness. He spoke because hiding the truth now would make every brave thing Luda had done feel like another lie. He told her about Rio Verde, about the soldiers he had led, the families he had watched march away from land that had fed them for generations, and the years of silence he had carried since, telling himself a guide was not the same as a soldier, that following orders was not the same as choosing cruelty. He had believed that lie for a long time. He did not believe it anymore. Before either of them could rest easy in that confession, hooves sounded on the trail again, slower this time, deliberate. Through the barn slats, Tobias saw two neighboring ranch hands riding behind Corman's men who had no love for him, but still knew the value of a clean brand and a crooked ledger. Rafe Corman returned before noon, several armed men trailing behind him, ready to make his accusations in front of the whole town if necessary. But Tobias walked out to meet him with the tally book in his hand, and Luda walked out beside him rather than hiding, refusing the false confession one final time, standing in the open exactly where Corman had wanted her invisible. It was enough, for now. That was the cruel mercy of the frontier. Sometimes the truth did not save a man. Sometimes it only bought him a few more hours. Corman's lies collapsed in front of witnesses he could not silence, and the deputy's badge would not save him from what the tally book proved. But that same tally book held names beyond Corman's own, other men across Camp Verde who had profited just as quietly from the same kind of theft. And theft like that rarely stays buried for long. That evening, Luda washed the blood from Tobias's yellow bandana and pressed it back into his hands. "I still don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly. "But today, you didn't make me do it." Tobias only managed a tired, rough laugh, the first real one in longer than he could remember. Somewhere out past the tree line, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of more horses approaching in the dark. Someone else was already coming to look for that tally book, and Camp Verde's reckoning had only just begun. I keep coming back to that winter road, not the clean version folks put in reports. I mean the real road. Old people trying to keep their feet under them, mothers carrying babies, sick folks pushed past what a body can take. Nearly 1,500 Yavapai and Tonto Apache people forced out of Verde Valley in February of 1875, then marched toward San Carlos like their homes were just some mistake on a government map. And they did not even take the easier wagon road. That tells you plenty. Men in offices always have a way of making suffering sound organized. Removal, reservation policy, relocation. Pretty words. But cold water does not care what word Washington used. A flooded river does not care who signed the order. When more than 100 people die from cold, exhaustion, injury, childbirth, and drowning, that is not paperwork. That is a grave stretched across the trail. I am not here to pretend every man on the frontier was innocent. He was not. But I know this much. When power takes a people's land, then makes them walk through winter to prove it, that ain't law. That is cruelty wearing government boots. So I ask you this. How many sins get called policy before decent men finally call them what they are?